So welcome. This is Fitwel Social Performance webinar number 2 in the series. In our first webinar, we looked at the research, the theory, and how we actually created the strategies within Fitwel Social Performance, the research base that was reviewed, etc. So we're not going to repeat the methodology behind creating Fitwel Social Performance. There is a recording of webinar number 1 if you guys want to dig deeper into that. Today, we're really going to look at the business case behind Fitwel Social Performance and social in general, understanding it from a why, a what, and a how perspective. So that is going to be the kind of structure of today's webinar. You are all welcome to submit questions. We do have Sarah Coughlin at EVORA, who's head of social. She'll be answering questions real time. And then if we have time at the end, Philippa and I will address any questions that are still unanswered. So we welcome your questions and we welcome this as an interactive conversation. So first, let me get started with introductions. I'm Joanna Frank. I'm the president and CEO of the 2 companies that run Fitwel. I'm based in New York City, and I'm very happy to be joined by Philippa Gill, who is the executive director of strategic accounts at EVORA Global. And Philippa is based in London, even though we both have British accents, just to confuse everybody. So it is great to be talking to you all on this subject. We've been working on Fitwel Social Performance for a long time. Philippa and I have actually known each other for 10 years, and we've been dreaming of this for a long time. So it's great to really be able to finally be sharing this with the industry at large. So we're excited to get started. So thank you. So I'm going to just establish a little bit of the definition that was established in that first webinar, just so everyone understands what we mean when we say social. What we've done for Fitwel Social Performance is that we've taken the evidence base, the health evidence base, we've overlaid it with the economic evidence base to identify strategies that are at the intersection of promoting health for people, really optimizing our built environment from a people perspective, and increasing the value or mitigating the risk of assets. So this is looking at asset value and mitigation of risk for asset. And it is the strategies that sit at the intersection of these 2 approaches that we have included in Fitwel Social Performance. So we may say social, we may say health, but just understand how those 2 things are related. As I said, we're going to look at this from a why, what, and how perspective. So why? Looking at a people perspective is the way to unlock value and mitigate risk for real estate. Why now? What's changed? Why is this suddenly the thing that everyone's talking about? The what is really getting into this. Let's talk about what strategies are we talking about? What is the evidence base? What is the impact? How can we make this really tangible? And how are we supporting the industry actually apply this at scale? What is the technology? What is FSP as a tool? And really, how do you get started as the industry? Because we're all in a different place as far as the journey is concerned around ESG and as far as S specifically is concerned. So that's going to be our structure of today. We are obviously going to start with the why, as it's the top of our list. So starting with why. Why a people perspective and why now?
So I'm going to take this one, and thanks everyone. This is Philippa speaking. It's quite interesting to me that as a real estate industry, where if you bear in mind that every single building that we have on the planet was either built for people to occupy or for them to use increasingly in a post-pandemic world, if you have to bear in mind that every time you click to buy something or have it delivered, it has to go through a building at some point. So it seems a little ironic for us as an industry to be asking why people at this point or why social impact. But I suppose those questions can apply to lots of things throughout the industry. One of the biggest things, if you cast your mind back to when we started as an industry, really bedding in the E part of ESG, so looking at consumption and looking at kind of reducing carbon in the buildings, it started in a similar way. It started with good practice going on in pockets, but not really a systemic approach to this. And there were very few frameworks, 15 years ago, in terms of how you could monitor this, set goals and measure. And it feels like we're at a similar point with the S. Certainly when we talk to investors, after carbon, S is the next one coming up, but some confusion over how do I approach that? How do I systemically put it in across my portfolios? And how do I capture the good practice that is going on, but obviously share that across my wider investment base? So we are seeing definitely in terms of the why, a driver coming from some of the very large asset allocators, if you want to put it that way, particularly pension funds, who obviously have a big vested interest in making sure that those of us who are putting our money into pension funds feel that it's being put to good use. And a lot of that is increasingly about making sure that what we do not only enhances the environment, but also creates a future that we all actually want to be in. So there's another question I think a lot we get asked, particularly when we're doing kind of strategies across pan-regional funds, across how do I put something in place that actually I can measure consistently, whether it's across different sector types or across the world, you know, big demand for something that actually is consistent and coherent and that can be, I suppose, articulated when you're coming to talking to the industry and even to your own employees about what this means, but then also measured and monitored in a way that you can actually drive progress. I think one of the big questions, and really why, you know, we've been working so happily with the Fitwel team on FSP, is the so what question, which we ask a lot. We can spend a lot of time gathering data and reporting under different disclosure mechanisms, but the so what question is, you know, is always the one that we try and put. Is it driving change? Is it actually helping demonstrate the return on investment, not just in terms of the pounds and dollars that are spent, but also the time and the effort and the initiative in the first place. So lots of reasons for why, and it really felt like the right time to try and help the industry start to manage this.
So, as I said at the beginning, from our perspective, people are the S in ESG. I think this is going to be the theme. We keep talking about people. It's people, right? It's people who are in buildings. It's the reason we build buildings is because of people. And so when we talk about social, we're really talking about how is our built environment, because we're real estate professionals, how is our built environment? How are our buildings? How are the practices that we operate, maintain, build our buildings? How is it having an impact on society? And society are the people. So we are really looking at how do we optimize our built environment for the people, and how do we understand both how our built environment is impacting people and their outcomes, whether it's their quality of life or their health. All of that is covered by public health research. So how are our built environments, how are our buildings impacting people? But in turn, how are people impacting the overall financial performance of real estate? And that is what makes it S. It isn't just that our built environment is impacting people, it is that it is also having a material impact on the value of our assets. And this is something that we can really understand now from this people perspective. And this is building on the E. So E is really looking, in my opinion, Philippa's the expert on this, at the physical risk for assets. We are now looking at the people risk. So that's how all of this comes together. And this is not new, right? Real estate value has always been a reflection of society's priorities and the risks to society. And this has changed fundamentally for our generation and will continue to change. One of the big things that has changed over the last 5 years, obviously, was COVID. COVID really brought health and public health particularly into focus for everybody. And we all now have a really tangible example of how a public health emergency like COVID really impacts assets. It impacts asset value. Obviously, it impacts people. The other big change, the big societal change that we're going through right now is climate change. And we are obviously looking at climate change now from how do we use our built environment, how do we adapt our built environment to maintain the quality of life for people and allow us to continue to live and thrive in a climate that is going to continue to become more extreme with time. So those are the two big changes that we as a generation are facing. We are post-COVID, demand has changed, and climate will continue to change and change the risk profile for real estate. I have some great stats up here because we always love our stats, of course. We are an evidence-based organization. So what we're looking at here is the other big evolving demand that we're seeing in the industry is a demand for data. Whether you are a tenant in a building, you are looking for data around the performance of that building, or whether you are an investor in real estate at the fund level, at an asset level, you are looking for data. ESG is really responding to that need and that desire for data. So 91% of investors say that they are going to be prioritizing healthy buildings due to tenant demand. They are going to want demonstration of how you are creating an environment that is healthy and responding to the demand of your tenants, your occupants, and the community at large. So big drive, big change in the marketplace. One of the big whys for using a standard, for using Fitwel, is the data. How do we create that data? We're also seeing that demand driver change across all different asset types. So COVID has had an impact on all people. It has impacted, therefore, all asset types, as people are obviously directly influencing every type of asset. So just a few of the stats and a few of the rationale behind the why for different asset types. So on the residential side, we're still seeing the market willing to pay more for health promoting environments. So on the residential side, which is actually the fastest growing user of Fitwel, so we're seeing a big increase in demand for health promoting residential environments, for houses, for multifamily, for student, for senior housing that can directly demonstrate how it's health promoting. So this is still an area that you can charge more for a health promoting environment generally than one that isn't. But we are seeing other different kind of demand drivers on other different sectors. So on the industrial sector, during COVID, industrial and manufacturing companies saw a 60% turnover in employees. And that is an unsustainable level of turnover of employees, right? It has a massive impact on productivity, on stability, et cetera. Some of the big drivers of that turnover in employees were health related, increasing levels of anxiety, concerns over safety, mental health issues, stress, et cetera, all of which can be mitigated by the physical environment that you're working in. So we're beginning to see on the industrial sector a real demand for differentiation in the market, especially as the industrial sector gets a little tighter. It's had obviously rapid demand over the last 5 years, but now we're beginning to see competition within that marketplace. How do you differentiate your industrial assets? You really prioritize the employees of those tenants. And then the last sector, office. A stat on office, obviously we're seeing on the office that COVID had a dramatic impact on occupancy rates for office, and that there's a real drive towards quality. And in order for you to be able to differentiate your asset in that tiny kind of micro environment within a city or within a built environment, being able to demonstrate how you're promoting health of the occupants of your building is a way to demonstrate quality. And it is also responding to demand coming from employees of your tenants. So 75% of employees expect their employer to provide health promoting environments and opportunities for them. So those are some of the demand drivers as far as why we should be really prioritizing a people perspective. Now we're going to go to the climate.
So this is a slide that we use a lot. It's from the last IPCC report, and I think it's so good at visualizing what the impact of this is going to be. Bearing in mind that when we talk about health, the reason at EVORA, for example, we call it social well-being, is that we couldn't find the line between an individual's health and societal health. So we stopped trying, in fact, and we called it social well-being. So you will hear lots of references to health, but if you look at this and imagine that you are putting together, this might be a slide that you'd think about using when looking at climate risk from a real estate value point in a traditional sense. Actually, when you start to layer all the scenarios that are going into lots of the strategies that we're seeing put into place across investment portfolios, this is just a different lens and a way of looking at that same. So when you do an assessment on a building or an acquisition and you decide, is that building going to be fit for purpose by whatever it is, 2030, 2050, and what do I need to underwrite in order to make sure that that happens? If you turn the lens around the other way and say, how are the occupiers and the users of that building going to operate or live or work, or in fact, be in the hospital in a very high temperature environment, it adds a different layer of complexity, but it also, I think, adds a very important layer of robustness to that. So we're very focused on the industry at the minute on looking at this slide and saying, okay, well, I clearly need to reduce GHG emissions, and I need to monitor and recognize and adapt to climate change. But what we're not good at, and what we're hoping FSP will help with, is flipping the lens on that and saying, and what does that mean for the actual people? And in order to remain an attractive investment class and retain value in the investment sense of the word, what should I be looking at and what kind of strategies? So the second piece of this is really important, which is adapting the built environment, but taking into account the occupants as well. And I'm sure everyone is doing what I always do in the slide, which is trying to put themselves in the right line on the right-hand side, just to see how toasty things are going to be. But when you start to look at this at a holistic and demographic sense, you'll start to see zones you know, and I don't want to name any of them now, where we are going to reach critical climate risk, whether it's either flood or in fact the reverse, which is severe drought. And we start to look at that in a building sense and saying, well, how is the building going to survive? I think what we forget to do a lot of times is think, is anybody going to want to be there? You know, if we have parts of, you know, Europe, specifically where I'm based, that are just going to be too hot or too uncomfortable and won't actually have enough water, the building can be as resilient as you like. But if the people around that building, in the town, in the city, in the area, don't want to live there because it's just too unpleasant or too difficult, then the building in its own right is pretty useless.
Yeah, absolutely. And just kind of what we were seeing last year coming out of the evidence base, and I think the big shift in the conversation that we saw at the end of 2023 was this understanding that the real estate industry has to continue to reduce its impact on climate change by reducing emissions. But at the same time, we now also have to adapt our built environment to maintain the quality of life for the occupants and the community at large that our buildings sit within. We have to do both things because unfortunately, climate change is happening and we will need to be able to use our buildings to offset some of the most extreme aspects of climate change. So I think it's really having both of those things held equally. And it's the second that we're really talking about, which is how do we adapt our built environment so that people, the population, society can continue to thrive in a way that's also equitable. Let's just throw that out there. Also, this is a big equity issue. Everybody doesn't have the same risk when it comes to exposure from extreme temperatures or climate change. In the US, a third of the population actually lives within areas of the country that is already at risk of extreme climate-related weather patterns. So this is not a future event. This is a now thing that we're talking about.
I think the other inequity, just on that, Joanna, is really about the different social levels of inequity. I would love to see FSP being used across all kind of government and affordable housing schemes, because one of the biggest correlations, of course, is poor building standards and poor building health linked directly to social inequity. And so there's a lot of investment going in this cycle into both residential and affordable housing. It would be great to see the same metrics being used and the same expectations across all kinds of asset and social classes.
Absolutely. And we're going to get into the what now, because what we're talking about is not rocket science, right? It is completely approachable and applicable across all asset types, existing assets, old, new, et cetera, right? This is none of the strategies or things that we as an industry haven't already thought about, but it's really a way to understand what we need to be prioritizing and what the inherent risks are in a given context as well. So we're going to dig into the what so that this becomes hopefully tangible and folks leave this webinar where they're really like, okay, I'm really beginning to get a handle on a good starting place. And I think Philippa and I would never say this is everything, right? We are not claiming that this is a comprehensive look at social. These are the strategies that we have identified with the strongest evidence base around health and asset value. This is a starting point, right? This is a good on-ramp for the industry. If you do anything, do this, basically. So what is FSP? What did we do? We talked about this a lot more in webinar 1, but I'm just going to do a quick recap. The Fitwel strategies that already exist in Fitwel, there are 150 strategies in the new V3 standard, which is launched on June 4th, for those of you who are following along. So we're very excited to have the new V3 standard. The new standard includes strategies looking at climate adaptation. They include strategies around biodiversity, et cetera. So the evidence base is expanded to really understand from a public health perspective the impact climate change is having on our environment and on people. So we have expanded the standard to align with that understanding of the evidence base. So Fitwel strategies, they are all health promoting. They define an environment optimized for people. What makes the strategies in FSP a little different is that we took that economic evidence base and we overlaid the economic evidence base with the existing Fitwel standard, so with those 150 strategies, and identified which strategies had the evidence base around health impact and impact on value, either in a positive ROI or in a negative as far as risk. And it is that subset of strategies that is behind FSP. There are about 40 strategies, depending on the asset type. I've just popped up some of the research behind this so that you can kind of see the research that we're looking at. As with all things Fitwel, this is academic, peer-reviewed, published research that we're relying on both on the health side and also on the economic side as well. It's taken us about 2 years to get to this point, just so you know how extensive this process was. And so what does this actually kind of look like? So we've taken those about 40 strategies, and then we further grouped them into what we're calling social performance outcome, targeted outcomes. So those 6 boxes you see in the middle are ways that we have grouped the 40 plus Fitwel strategies into buckets that really align with the existing frameworks of ESG globally. We do not want to reinvent the wheel. We really want to show the industry how Fitwel strategies, how health promoting strategies fit in with the existing frameworks. We've named a few of them at the bottom, but they include the EU taxonomy, the UN SDG goals, as well as GRESB. Which recognizes FSP already. So those 6 buckets are supporting high quality environments. So that's really the inside of the buildings. Create resilience, which we're going to talk more about, because obviously those strategies very much sit at the intersection between E and S. The next one is engaging stakeholders, promoting equity, optimizing environments for walking and active transportation, so really location strategies. And then the last one, which is also new, is access to biophilia. So for those of you in the UK, obviously a lot of conversation about biodiversity and biophilia. There are a lot of strategies also that we've identified that sit at that intersection between health impact and economic impact. And then you can see for Create Resilience specifically, we're looking at, for Create Resilience, it is impacting health, it's impacting community health, it's impacting morbidity, which really is correlated to overall life expectancy, instills feelings of well-being, that's mental health, equity, and also safety. And then on the economic side, which I can't really see because of our little boxes, but it's also impacting many of the economic outcomes as well, including return on investment, mitigating risk, and NOI, I think net operating income. So is this affecting the day-to-day costs of your buildings? So if we drill down further, what we did is we looked at the evidence base, we looked at those 5 economic impact categories that you can see on the right-hand side of the screen. All of the evidence base is looking at strategies, looking at evidence base that is connecting strategies to at least 1 or 2 of those economic impact categories. If we just look at the return on investment impact category, because I know that that's the one that is spoken about most often in real estate, of course, what is the impact on ROI? I think I've been asked that question for at least 10 years at this point. We can now actually answer that question. So these are the Fitwel strategies that we have identified that we can demonstrate with the evidence base that they have an impact, and what the impact is on return on investment at the evidence base level, right? Not for individual buildings. We can't tell you like personally that this is going to increase your building by £2 a square foot, but we can say that the evidence base is there, that these strategies have an overall impact on return on investment. And you can see that there are a pretty broad range of strategies, from noise control, bike infrastructure, biophilia, and the climate resilience. Maintenance, always love the maintenance. Climate resilience is the one we're going to just drill down on a little further so you can kind of see. So within climate resilience, there are 4 strategies. There's flood-prone zone, stormwater management, heat island mitigation, and supporting biodiversity. All of those have an evidence base that they are impacting the return on investment of your assets in different ways. And then if we start to really geek out, because we are pretty geeky over at Fitwel, so this is just a little bit of our spreadsheet, which is looking at the strategies within that Create Resilience section. So now we're drilling down. The mapped Fitwel strategies are all of the strategies in the V3 standard that impact climate resilience, impact health, and impact economic value. So here you can see which of the health impact categories are impacted by each of these strategies. I won't read it off, right? You guys can see this for yourselves. And then you can see now this new information about which of these strategies have an impact on economic outcomes. So you can see the return on investment ones, but you can also see net operating income, employee productivity, etc. So this is what underpins all of FSP. Lots of data, lots of charts, lots of evidence base. And if we further drill down, because we just love to get into the weeds, on heat island mitigation, a strategy that I think will be very familiar to everybody. This is something, obviously, that folks have been looking at when it comes to environmental. This obviously has a physical risk aspect to the actual physical property itself, and it absolutely has a risk to people as well. So implementing strategies, and obviously the Fitwel standard gives you those strategies, implementing strategies that impact heat island effect, such as having high albedo pavements and roofs, so having light-colored finishes and so on your roofs and your pavements and so on, decreases the heat generated by your building. Likewise, if you have shading and street trees, vegetation, etc., all of these things are demonstrably shown to decrease the actual temperature of your building. Heat island mitigation impacts morbidity, so overall life expectancy. It's an equity issue. It promotes mental health, and it also impacts the surrounding community. For those of you who live in New York or anywhere really that uses air conditioning, we all know what it's like to walk along a dark pavement in the middle of the summer with all of that heat being churned out by air conditioners onto the street. It's really pleasant. So we can kind of see. But this isn't just a quality of life issue. Heat-related deaths are some of the highest of all of the different categories as far as climate change is concerned. And then on the economic impact category, what we're able to show is that for every degree that you reduce the temperature of your building, there's actually a $50 return on investment as far as the ROI is concerned. And you're also looking at a saving on your operating costs of an average of $1,000 per building per year. So this is the kind of the rationale behind everything that we're doing. How is it impacting health? What are the specific strategies that you need to employ in order to impact health? And then how is that impacting value or risk? And so that's the kind of the nuts and bolts behind everything that you're seeing with FSP. So now we're going to get onto the how piece, and we're pretty much on time, Philippa. For those of you who know us, you know that both of us have...
you know how hard it is for Joanna and I to stay on time. We could talk about this for days, or in fact 10 years, which is what we've been doing.
Indeed. So I'm going to start with the how, and Philippa is going to take the rest of the time on the how. First of all, we want to kind of talk about how FSP works with the existing Fitwel approach, which is the asset level certification. So we have designed FSP, which is really an entity-wide approach. You're looking at strategies and groupings of strategies and applying them across multiple different buildings, assets, across an entire fund and across an entire portfolio. That is how FSP is designed. It's a kind of, if I use my hand, it's a horizontal approach with subsets of strategies. The asset level certification is really a deep dive for an individual asset. And then the demand for the two is different. There is still, as we said at the beginning, there is a strong demand from tenants for health promoting environments. So the asset certification is really giving you that opportunity to differentiate your individual asset and respond to individual demand from your tenants. So that's the asset certification. And FSP is designed to understand your portfolio as a whole when it comes to risk and when it comes to return on investment, and really optimize all of your assets, set all of your assets on a roadmap so that you can make continuous improvements across all of your assets, regardless of how high they score. So FSP isn't about hitting 90 points like the asset certification. It's really understanding how is my asset performing against these strategies, and then how do I use that to inform a roadmap going forward. So the two are using the same strategies. They are completely intertwined. If you start with either approach, it will actually generate, inform your data as far as your overall Fitwel performance. So either way will get you the same kind of insight into your assets and into your entities as a whole. So the two are supposed to go together. We actually have users already using them in combination, and so we'll be able to start to share those stories later in the year as folks have gone through the process. So it's exciting to see how they're going together. And together, this is an approach that actually you can use across 100% of your assets. Because there is no minimum performance on FSP, it means that you can use it across every asset, understand, benchmark every asset. So we just keep kind of looking at how do we make good on our promise, which is the for all part of Fitwel, right? We are building health for all. This is us saying, okay, individual asset certification is probably only applicable to 5-10% of the highest performing assets in the portfolio. How do we create a product, create a framework, create a pathway that allows all the rest of the assets to be part of this conversation and really be put on this roadmap. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Philippa to get really into the how.
So when Joanna and I started talking about how would we really start to enable the industry to start putting S metrics into their strategies and their performance management, you have to think of it, visually with actually what we've come out with these 6 key strategies is almost like the top left of the spreadsheet. There are hundreds of other metrics underneath, but asking people, as I said at the beginning, to collect data that for the moment is impossible to get, it just adds another exercise in frustration. And heaven knows we are frustrated enough as an industry with all the disclosure that's going on. So what we really like about this is when we put strategies in place, it allows, I suppose, a very easy onboarding of S metrics into existing strategies and metrics. So the first thing, as we said, is to look at those 6 outcome areas and decide on the ones that are most applicable either to the fund or the whole portfolio, depends at which level you're going to apply this. And then obviously do your benchmarking and gap analysis, which is always what we recommend in any approach that goes into a strategy to understand what your starting point is. You can then take those, and as you've seen, we love spreadsheets as well. You can take those metrics that sit underneath that and start to embed those in. And really, for me, what I think is really an additional benefit to the whole codification of this process is it allows people to start to educate both their own teams and their investment teams and the investors that are investing into those assets about which metrics are starting to drive performance. The link here, and I think this is one of the questions that has been asked in the chat that's very important, is the evidence base that sits underneath this, and particularly when we look at things like the climate resilience piece, the natural juxtaposition as to how physical climate risk is really starting to impact society and the humans in those buildings, or the people, as we like to call them. Often, I think, people inside buildings get called occupiers or clients or tenants or even the rent roll. This is really setting them back, I think, where they deserve to be, which is as the people inside those buildings. As Joanna said, lots of flexibility, so it doesn't matter how you apply these strategies, but it is a way that you can actually start to look at your own portfolio and then move the dial on those, adding more and more metrics as the strategy evolves.
And then I think the part that's really important is this kind of, where do you get started? And we pulled up some screenshots. This is the future of Fitwel, which is exciting. On the 4th of June, not only are we releasing our new standard, but we're also releasing our new tech, which is, nothing like piling on, right? Anyway, so the new tech is exciting. This is not what you'll see when you log on June 4th. This is the next generation, but where we really start to look at not just your performance for an individual asset, but what does that mean as a true benchmark, i.e. what does that mean in relation to your peers? And I think that is an important next step for the industry, because unlike with E, where I think there's a good understanding of what good, better, and best looks like, there are goals that have been set globally, like the Paris Accord and so on, that folks are really aware of and are using as their North Star as far as what good looks like and what achievement folks are heading towards. We don't have that for S. And so I think it's important to understand the good, better, and best in S by really looking at your peers. Like, how are you aligning with peers? What is typical in the industry for different asset types? And obviously, as that data set gets larger, we'll be able to further and further drill down, which is what Philippa and I were talking about earlier, is really getting into small subsets so you can really understand kind of how your asset is performing. Philippa, anything else you want to talk about kind of benchmarking?
Well, I think the industry has become, benchmarking is almost an industry essential for anything that's coming in. The question we always get asked was, well, if I'm 75 out of 100, that's great, but where's everybody else? That's frankly human nature. We all like to know what our peers are doing, but I think it also sets the industry standard. There are certain metrics that are easy across both E and S, and in fact G, that apply more easily to certain metrics, certain sectors in the industry than others. What is a 75 across an industrial portfolio is probably fantastic. I'm inventing, by the way, please don't quote me on these numbers. But maybe it might be not a great score across others. So I think it is very important to use a benchmark, both as an internal tool, but also just to understand where individual sectors are kind of, influencing the individual metrics underneath.
Absolutely. And what we've been able to do is, Fitwel's now 5, so we have big data sets, which is great. So when we're looking at your peer data, even though FSP is a new approach, the strategies, as I said, are Fitwel strategies. And so we're able, in the most part, when those strategies were in 2.1, to pull the data set from peer performance over the last 5 years and actually have a robust data set, which allows for further drilling down, that we are able to, at this point, look at the asset type as well. So it's not just you against the rest of the industry as far as your performance, but we can start to look at what does this look like for multifamily residential compared to other multifamily residential, which is really important because, as Philippa just said, we see great variation in different asset type performance. So we see on the multifamily residential, if you are doing 3 out of 9 of the indoor environment strategies within that first high quality environment, 3 out of 9 for multifamily residential will put you in the top 10th percentile, whereas 6 out of 9 for office will only get you into the kind of the top quartile, basically. So big difference as far as the what strategies have been applied in different asset types, and then industrial, again, very different performance, different set of priorities, and so on. So really important we understand from all of you that we look at your peers when looking at those benchmarks, because it just makes more sense. And so these are just a couple of screens. We're drilling down further into the metrics as well. This is another consistent theme that we've heard against social, and that is, what are the metrics for social? So part of FSP is that we've identified 15 metrics from those targeted outcome categories that are all demonstrably S metrics. And so, again, not rocket science, nothing that you haven't seen before, but really just saying these are S metrics, folks. And the reason that they're S metrics is because they're impacting society and they're impacting the material value of your assets. They have a material impact on your assets. Philippa, on next steps.
So getting started, and one of the important things is, when I talk to a lot of the clients that I look after, they're like, oh, I know I've got to start putting social in, but it just feels like too enormous. Nobody understands it yet. Where do I start? And is it just going to complicate everybody's lives? So if we haven't labored the point enough in today's session, I'm going to labor it one more time. You don't have to eat the whole cake in one go this way. A lot of the ones I think that we're at EVORA starting to put on top of existing ESG strategies with all of the metrics that go into performance measurement afterwards is the obvious ones for us, which is climate resilience and stakeholder collaboration. The rest, can easily come afterwards. But I think as, the pieces to bite off first, certainly for ESG teams and for asset managers and investment managers who are already thinking about a holistic approach, they're probably the easiest ones to just inhale or ingest, for more food references, into the strategy there. The reports that come out really speak to, I suppose, the numbers and the metrics and the approach that I think the industry's adopted across ESG more widely. So it will feel fairly familiar. Joanna's put here the GRESB recognized. We're not going to labour that point, but it is GRESB recognized. But I think also very importantly is the correlation there between, as we've talked about earlier, between existing there might be, physical climate risk strategies or just, mitigation across the portfolio generally is really the benefit of adding the value drivers, as we've seen, that come inherent with those FSP metrics. So, firstly, look at the 6 options, choose the ones you want, get yourself benchmarked, decide which metrics you're going to put into your strategy. There's clearly a piece of education to be done internally, I would imagine, and then start putting into the strategies. As Joanna said, there's already the benefit of this. It comes with 5 years worth of data that's benchmarkable already. So the industry is not starting from scratch. But on top of that, something we didn't mention actually, Joanna, is the pilot program has seen some very large portfolios go through FSP. We've had a fantastic kind of steering group for the FSP pilot, and that will add even more data into those bars you see underneath for that benchmarking. So there are people going through it. We're now in kind of obviously signing up for the next phase, and I really, I think when we start to talk to this about ESG teams and investment teams, it's fairly easy to adopt. They get the language, they understand where it's coming from, they understand the link across the metrics quite easily. Sorry, and we're starting to see those metrics now coming into portfolios.
Absolutely. And Philippa mentioned the pilot. So we're sharing this all with you before it's fully baked. And we're doing that on purpose because obviously we see ourselves as a partner to the industry. And we really rely on the feedback of all of you, our users, to ensure that what we're creating, how we're talking about it, what we're prioritizing as far as the data and the metrics and the ease of use of the tech, all of that is directly informed by our users. And so during the pilot process, we're really making a lot of changes, not to the evidence base, not to the strategies, but to how we present them, what data goes into that report that you saw at the end. So you don't just get an online set of stats with FSP, you also get a report at the end of the year that you can then directly use into your ESG reporting or for investor reporting, or you can use it with your tenants, whomever's asking for this information. We are trying to create efficiency. What we hear consistently across everybody that we speak to, regardless of whether they're in the US, if they're in Europe, if they're in the UK, APAC region, doesn't matter, that everybody sitting in those ESG teams is really swamped with data collection, with reporting, and that we as an industry, especially on the certification and the framework side, have to create efficiency because at the moment, folks are spending so much time reporting and gathering data that they aren't getting to the action side of the so what. Okay, so great, you have a benchmark, you understand, the baseline for your building. How are you now using that information to inform future investment in that asset so that you can have that continuous improvement both towards your social goals, but also financial goals as well? So I think really looking at creating, this is why we use tech in the first place. How do you ensure that our tech, that our actual platform is supporting the industry in a way that is making the best use of your time? So efficiency of ingesting that data, but also efficiency of sharing that data across everything else that you're doing. This is our goal. This is our this is what we are looking to do, right? This is where we see ourselves. We're kind of one of those in the middle pieces where we ingest data, and then we also have data that you're using in other ways. So that is a commitment that we're making in order to do that in a way that directly is reflective of your needs. That's where the pilot folks come in, right? They are using Fitwel, they're using it on the asset and at FSP, using it together and then telling us, how do I make this an efficient process? So we really do appreciate all of our Fitwel pilot users to date and encourage those of you who are interested, obviously, to contact us about joining the pilot and becoming part of that group who are going to really inform the way that this moves forward. So at that point, my goodness, we are so on time.
I'm terrified by how on time you are.
We're going to take questions from folks. I'm going to stop sharing so I can actually see the questions.
So thank you, Sarah. We've had some questions answered as we go through. There was one that I wanted to take, which I hope has actually been answered at this. So what's the difference between asset level certifications like LEED and WELL or WELL at scale for portfolios? I hope we've made it clear. FSP really is the junction between health and social performance and value. I don't think there's any, and Joanna, I'm sure you know better than I do, that there is no other tool, whether it's a certification or not in the industry, that provides that evidence-backed, fully researched, academically, online available, linked to value. And that was very important for us because I think Joanna and I have spent long enough in the real estate investment industry to know that if an investor or an investment manager can't see the direct value in doing something, where is the motivation at the end of the day, unless they're an impact investor? So it has to drive value. Now we know, I was an asset manager in the past. We know good buildings that people enjoy being in retain and create and drive value. But there was never really a methodology. You just felt like you were kind of shouting into the wind going, but it's a great building, so people love it, so they'll pay more for it. It needed a little bit more research than just because we know. So I hope that's answered that. It's really a very different approach.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think the biggest difference between an asset certification, which we talked about, I use my hand gestures, an asset level certification, whether it's Fitwel or any of the other asset certifications, is really looking at a deep dive into that individual asset. For Fitwel, it's about 75, 80 strategies per asset. And there's a minimum standard that you have to reach for asset certification. So in the case of Fitwel, it's 90 points to get your 1 star. Everybody has different minimum requirements in order to reach that certification. So that is really about like, how am I looking at my individual building or group of buildings and understanding how they, in this case, are impacting and being optimized for the people in the buildings and the community at large. And then I'm getting that kind of, I'm demonstrating compliance with the standard and meeting a minimum standard. What we have done with FSP approach is so that 100% of assets can participate and really generate that baseline, that benchmark, and generate a roadmap. Right, that's the point. The point for us at Fitwel has always been, how do we actually change the market so that it is being optimized for people? So not just about like, this building is the highest performing building when it comes to health. Okay, that's interesting. But what is more interesting is understanding all buildings, because all buildings are impacting health. All buildings are impacting the people that they come into contact with. How do we understand all buildings, and how do we use the same evidence base to create roadmaps so that each asset can have that continuous improvement pathway that is guided by the evidence base, that is built, that there is a rationale behind the decisions that are being made for the improvement of that asset. And that's what we're trying to get at here. We're looking at, so take that subset of strategies, those targeted outcomes, each one is about 6 to 9 strategies. How do you take that set of strategies and then understand the performance of all of your assets based on those strategies? And it's not about like, oh, I need 100%, I need 100 for my walk score in order to get enough points here. That's not the point here. The point is, what is the walkability of that asset? Because that is letting you know something about that asset. And when it comes to social performance, it's not about like, oh, I need to have a high number when it comes to walkability. It's understanding where you are, really understanding those existing conditions so that you can then make informed decisions about how to continuously improve that individual asset. All right, because we can't rebuild our built environment, right? Nobody, Philippa and I, would absolutely say that is not the way that we are going to address climate change. We cannot build our way out of this, right? We have to adapt our existing built environment, all of our existing built environment. How do we continuously make improvements across all of our assets? That's the point of this. And so I think that that's fundamentally why we created it, so that all assets can participate. Someone's asked a question here about tenant resources. Yeah. And so some of those economic impact categories are actually within return on investment, as well as specifically looking at tenant productivity, tenant engagement, and so on. So there are a lot of tenant metrics behind those big economic buckets, which look at tenant retention, renewal rates, et cetera, et cetera. So happy to drill down, whomever this is. I think,
Joanna, this is probably more, for occupiers themselves, for people in the buildings themselves, and anything that they can be doing kind of almost within their corporate.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So we do have those resources. We specifically have an approach which is looking at the tenant space. So one of the scorecards is looking at tenant spaces. So we've already kind of looked at it from a tenant perspective, absolutely. And there is loads that you can do as a tenant, even if you don't control the building as a whole, there's still a lot that you can do. And in fact, we put out a guide. If this is for office, we've actually put out a guide also on how to optimize your office space, regardless of where you are in a lease event, right? If you're choosing the office space, what should you look for? If you're in an existing office and it's getting renovated, what should you prioritize? If you're in an existing office and you're between any kind of capital improvement, what can you do from an operational standpoint and a policy standpoint? So happy to share that. Maybe someone who's on the call, on the webinar from my team can pop the office guide into this. But yeah, absolutely. We definitely, I mean, tenants, people are the point. We also have, if you're in the industrial sector, and I'm not sure what sector this person's in, we also have a guide which is called A Better Box, which is looking at how to optimize industrial properties for the occupants of those buildings, for the people within.
For me, I mean, we find that's really important, both on the, I suppose, the E side and the S side. People often look at kind of logistics, warehousing, industrial, and just think it's just too difficult, because they're usually single tenant and they don't have any control, and they kind of get dismissed in many ways. So I think it's really important that we are able to demonstrate that you shouldn't just kind of drop them off the agenda and not pay attention. Just on that last question that's come in, Joanna, I'll let you answer. But one thing I wanted to talk about is why we call it social performance and not social value. And we spent a long time on both sides in our teams going, what shall we call this? We know from the work we do at EVORA that there are very different ways about talking about social value. And in fact, I think we addressed this in our first webinar in different countries. We have that across Europe. And then when you get between Europe and APAC and then the US, it complicates life even more. So there's a very specific reason we've called this social performance, because it ties in with performance management and ESG management more holistically, rather than a defined way of calculating not the asset value impact, but the individual valuation impact of a particular strategy. Now, that is very much embedded in a specific city or region. We were asked recently if we could do it in Paris, and we're like, yes, if we had 15 years and we can go and research all the metrics, and we were based in Paris. So I'll let Joanna answer in terms of the partnering and the CFAD piece, but there's a very specific reason why this is not addressed as social value.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you. Just to kind of reiterate that we are looking at asset value rather than the value that is being created to the community at large. Now, many of the strategies are creating value at the community at large, but that isn't the piece. Obviously, there's already a methodology in place to look at social value from that definition. And so we don't need to replicate, right? We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We wanted to, again, make sure that we are a piece of this puzzle and a piece of the puzzle that is currently doesn't exist, right? So we really looked at how are these strategies impacting health and impacting asset value and risk to assets. So that's what generated the evidence base that we looked at and all of those pieces. And I would say that it's complementary to the way that folks are looking at social value, because social value is looking at the impact on the community at large, and we're looking at the impact on that asset. So that's the two go together, I would say, that they're complementary. Okay, if you're currently pursuing Fitwel Gold, which I think is probably 2 stars, should we advise the client about the new FSP standard being launched? Construction has commenced and finishes in 2 years. I would say that if you are using Fitwel on an individual building, that you should continue to use the asset certification that you're using already. So for individual buildings, you should definitely be using the asset certification, right? That is the way that you differentiate your individual building in the marketplace, right? It's still the moniker, it's still a demonstration of quality that we talked about at the beginning, and that it is a way to continue to differentiate your asset. FSP is really looking at if you're working across a portfolio of assets, if you're working across a fund with many assets that are all performing at different standard, like different levels, that's really the FSP target. We are working with a company who has a big portfolio of assets, student housing actually, and some of those assets will get individual asset certification and the rest will go through FSP. And so that they then have a good understanding of their fund or their portfolio of assets, depending on how they group their properties, but they'll understand all of their assets, understanding again that probably only 5 to 10% of our built environment can actually get Fitwel certified as an individual asset. So it is still a mark of differentiation for an individual asset to be able to get that asset certification. We definitely designed this to go together.
I think, I mean, really to boil it down very simply, FSP doesn't really, it's not designed to work at an individual asset level. It's really about a holistic strategic approach to embedding this into a wider strategy across the building. But as Joanna says, you can then, once you've got your benchmark and you can see your whole portfolio, it's fairly obvious then to pick out the ones that you might want to pursue, a full Fitwel certification.
Absolutely. I mean, I think what we were looking to do is to create for the industry an on-ramp, knowing that we want to be able to serve all buildings, all buildings, the entire market, and that an individual asset certification is never going to be able to do that. That was the motivation. How do we create a new on-ramp, a way to use this incredible body of knowledge, which is the Fitwel standard, in a way that's accessible now to all buildings, regardless of whether they're scoring 20 or whether they're scoring 120? Because for us, it's actually more exciting to work with the company, with the buildings that are at 20, because obviously you can have a much greater impact on the overall experience of that building. And so that's kind of always been our ethos, right? And it's always been our goal to share the data with you as well. And that getting your kind of individual asset certification and that kind of plaque on the wall is great, but answering the so what question has always been the point. All right, so now you know where you're performing today. What do you want to look like in 3 years' time? Like, what is the increase? What are the goals for performance that you want to attain in 3 years' time, or 2 years' time, or whatever it is, right? So I think that the so what question, as the understanding of the industry, as the kind of what denotes a high performing building, or what denotes performance, continues to elevate as people become more and more aware of ESG and the inherent risk of climate change and health and demand shifting because of COVID, all of these things that are happening. We're seeing more and more questions, more and more interest in the so what. Okay, great. I have a certification. Okay, great. I've benchmarked. Now, how does that inform how I continuously invest in that asset so that I can drive the performance of that asset? And then how do I show that in data in a way that, you know, is relevant to not just my ESG reporting, but also the investors that we're working with, or the tenants that we're working with, et cetera, across all teams. So I think it's answering the so what. That's the whole point here, is understanding where you are today, and then what does that mean for the roadmap? What does that mean for that continuous journey for that asset to improve over time?
I mean, I think we're seeing across EVORA, you know, given who we work with, you know, especially in the current market as we come out of it, you know, every piece of CapEx really has to fight for its place, you know, to be approved. And it's, you know, if you can't prove the ROI on that CapEx, it's going to really struggle to get through.
Yeah.
So to Joanna's point, it was very important to us that we link that to asset value in the wider sense of the world, and hence why we ended up with social performance, not just social value.
Yeah.
So we're 2 minutes before time. If anyone has a last question they want to throw in, get it in now, I think, but it looks like we have no more. So the QR code was, I hope everyone got that on the end. We will be circulating and making the deck available. Thank you all for joining.
One last look at the QR code. We'd love to hear from you all. We'd love to continue this conversation. Yes, CFAD would love more data, always more data, right? They are our research team. For those of you who know the difference between the two companies, CFAD is the research part of the organization. So whoever asked if we'd be interested in working with them, the answer is always, we'd love to have a conversation and see where you are on your journey and what data you have. So thank you for that. Thank you for the offer.
And that will take you to Fitwel. If you want to get in touch with the EVORA, either in Europe or in the US, you can get hold of us. It's very easy. It's contact@evoraglobal.com, or just go to our website. But through either channel, whether you go through Fitwel or through us, you'll end up at the same place.
Great. Well, thank you all. Philippa, thank you so much. It's been a good conversation. And
gold stars for finishing on time.
All right. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye.